Welcome to Highline Excel 2016 video number 4. Hey, if you want to download this file, Business 218 Video 4 Start file. There's also the finished file. And don't forget, there's PDF notes for each one of these videos. Now, if you want to download any of these files and follow along, click on the link below the video. Now, these PDF notes have 14 pages of all sorts of amazing notes for our topic, which is the 9 different types of references that we can have in Excel. We can have relative cell references, absolute, mixed cell references with a row lock, mixed cell references with a column lock. We can have sheet cell references, workbook cell references, 3D cell references, defined names, and of course, table, formula, and nomenclature. Now, let's go over to the sheet references. We have 25 amazing examples. Now, the 4 basic types of cell references are relative, absolute, mixed cell reference with a column lock, or mixed cell reference with the row lock. Now, we actually do not need to consider what type of basic cell reference we have if we're never copying the formula. But as soon as we copy a formula that contains cell reference, then we need to consider which one of these cell references we need. Now, our first 2 examples, we're going to look at cell references when you're not copying the formula. So here's our first example. We have revenue and expense. We need to calculate net income. It's pretty easy formula, revenue minus expenses. So I click in cell B9, equal sign, and I'm going to use my arrow keys. Up arrow, minus up arrow. Revenue minus expenses, but I am not copying this formula, so I'm not even going to think about what type of cell reference it is. I'm just going to hit enter. And there it is, 13,338. Now, our second example is a finance example. We have $3,500, which we are going to invest at the end of each year for our retirement. We're going to do this for 15 years, and we're going to assume a constant interest rate of 4.5%. Now, if we were investing in a bank CD or a guaranteed fund, then this amount would be a contractual amount, and it would be 4.5% every year. If you're investing in the stock market, this would then have to be your best estimate of the rate you're going to earn over the next 15 years. Now, Excel has all sorts of amazing financial functions. And if we're putting this money in for 15 years, our goal is to calculate what's called the future value. That means at the end of 15 years, how much will we have in our account? Well, future value, they named the built-in function for future value smartly, FV. Now, you can read screen tips before you actually hit Tab and accept it from the drop-down list. This screen tip will tell you what the function does. Now, let's read this. Returns the future value of an investment based on periodic, constant payments and a constant interest rate. That's exactly what we have, and that is a typical type of financial investment situation. I'm going to hit Tab. Now, the future value function has 5 arguments, and these arguments are very similar across many of the financial functions in Excel. Rate simply means the period rate. For us, we have an annual rate, so our period is 1 year, so we put the cell reference for that 4.5%. Now, this formula is never going to be copied anywhere, so I don't need to worry about what type of cell reference that is. Now I simply type comma. NPER, that means total number of periods. For us, our period is 1 year, so we have a total of 15 years. So I click on that cell reference. I don't need to worry about what type of cell reference. I just put it in the NPER argument, comma. PMT is the universal finance variable for payment. That means some equal amount that we're putting in to our account each period. For us, it's 3,500. Now, when I click on 3,500, sure, I do not have to worry about what type of cell reference because I'm not copying it. But in finance, you always have to worry about cash flow. Remember, this is us. We are giving this money to the bank. So anytime you have a cash flow, in order for all of the different financial functions to work in Excel, you have to know whether this is a negative cash flow or a positive cash flow. So here's the trick. You ask, hey, is this cash flow coming into my wallet or purse, or is it coming out of my wallet or purse? Now, don't worry about whether this is your money in the investment. It's just cash flow. So watch what happens. If you're holding your purse or wallet in your hand, this cash is coming out of your purse or wallet and into the bank. So for us, this cash flow has to be negative. Out of our wallet or purse, into the bank. So we always have to come here, if it's a negative cash flow, and put a minus. These functions don't work. All of finance is based on cash flow, either positive or negative. By the way, if you were doing the same calculation for the bank, then of course the bank, when you give this to the bank, you'd be from their point of view, they would be receiving it as a positive. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3 cell references. These other arguments have square brackets. And as we learned in our prerequisite class and earlier in this class, if you know what the defaults are for those square bracket arguments, you don't have to put them in. We don't have any present value. That would be how much we already have in the account. We don't have any. And the type means, hey, is that cash flow happening at the beginning of the period or the end? For us, it's always at the end, and that is the default. All right, I simply close parentheses. I don't need to worry about what type of cell reference, and enter. And whoa, check that out, 72,744.19 cents. Now, if you actually get this on the day you retire or 15 years later, right, the question is, how much interest did I have? Well, first, we have to figure out how much we have invested. Well, this is another formula. We are not copying it anywhere. So I'm going to say equal sign and then a bunch of up arrows to get my amount times 3 up arrows to get number of years. That's it. We put $3,500 in 15 times. That will give us our total invested. And we're not copying this anywhere, so I just hit enter. I don't got to worry about what type of cell references those are. Now we can calculate total interest. Hey, equals the amount I get to pull out after 15 years minus the total amount I put in. We're not copying this formula anywhere, so I simply hit enter. Wow, $20,000 in interest. All right, so our first two formulas we were not copying, but let's scroll down. And we're going to look at our same two examples, income statement and making an investment. But in this case, we have to copy our formula, so we have to think about what type of cell references they are. All right, here we are, January to May, revenue minus expenses. So I do my formula equals up arrow, minus up arrow. But wait a second. I'm definitely going to enter this and copy it over. So I need to think about, do I want this relative, absolute, or mixed? Well, for us, since we're copying it, we're always going to need to go 1, 2 cells above to get the revenue, subtracting 1 cell above to get the expenses. These are called relative cell references because it means from the formula's point of view, where do you always look? You always look 1, 2 cells above and 1 cell above. So Control-Enter to put the formula in the cell and keep the cell selected. I point to my fill handle, and when I see my crosshair or angry rabbit, I click and drag. I go to the last cell, I hit F2, and sure enough, those are relative cell references. 1, 2 cells above minus 1 cell above. All right, enter. Now let's do our finance example, and this will be an example of relative and absolute cell references. We still have our 3,500, 15 years, but if we're investing, for example, in the stock market, I don't really know exactly what rate I'm going to get. So I might want to see what the future value will be over various rates. Hey, watch this. I'm going to say equals FV tab, the rate. Well, that's always going to be relative cell reference, 1 cell to my left. So as I copy the formula down, I will always get the 3, then the 4, then the 5, comma. NPER means total number of periods. That's going to be 15. Now, as I copy this down, I need it locked on B32. Right now, if I didn't do anything, it would always look 1, 2, 3 cells above. So if I was in the last cell here, it would be getting the number of years, 1, 2, 3 cells above. That's not what I want, so I lock it with the F4 key. Now notice it put two $signs in, one in front of the column reference B and one in front of the row reference 32. That means this cell will remain locked on B32, even if I copy it across the columns, the letters, or down across the rows, in our case, across the numbers. So NPER locked on 15, that is fine, comma. Then our periodic payment. Remember, this is cash flow coming out of our wallet or purse and going to the bank. So we have to put a minus sign to indicate that that cash flow is negative. I'm going to lock this one with the F4 key also. Two $signs, one for the column reference, one for the row reference. Now the default for present value is 0, and the type of payment end of the period are the default, so I can close parentheses. Control Enter to put the formula in the cell. Keep the cell selected. I point to my fill handle, and when I see my angry rabbit, I double click and send it down. I immediately come to the last cell and F2 to verify that I have relative cell reference for our rate, and NPER and payment are both locked as absolute cell references. And Enter. Now, we want to go look at our next example, example 5, and it's going to illustrate relative and absolute cell reference. Now, our goal, this is an income statement. We have revenue, for expenses, total expenses, and net income. Our goal is to calculate each expense as a percentage of revenue. These will be called expense ratios. And we will use them in next year's budgets. Now, each one of these numbers is the average over the last 5 years. And if we can calculate each one of these expenses as a percentage of revenue, we can use the percentages to help us estimate our projected numbers in our budget, which will be our next example. All right, I'm going to click up in cell C48, and our percentage formula will be equal sign, one cell to my left. That's a relative cell reference divided by, and I need revenue, which is in B48, and I need to lock it with the F4 key. Now, when I Control Enter, that cell has already got number formatting. You can see it's got the percentage number format up here. Now I want to copy it down, but I'm not going to use my fill handle because I don't want a 0 right there. Control C to copy that cell. Then I'm going to click in C50, hold Shift. And to highlight, I'm using my down arrow. Now I can Control V, and it pastes that formula all the way down. Now, it actually removed the border formatting that I pasted. So I'm going to come down here, click the drop down on the Smart tag, and say Paste Formulas Only. That way I won't lose my formatting. Now let's look at this formula, F2. Sure enough, it got relative cell reference, cost of goods sold expense divided by revenue. So for each one of these, we now have a percentage that we can use in our budgeting process. Now, one thing about ratios, this 46.46%, one way to interpret it is this. For every $1 that comes into this business, 46.46 pennies will go to cost of goods sold. For operating, every $1 into the business, 19.48 pennies will be used up for operating expense. Now, a great trick when you're doing ratios is this. Notice I just did the numbers, but if we also consider what the units are, this of course is dollars, but it's also cost of goods sold. This is dollars, but it's revenue. So notice in the numerator I have a certain number of dollars in cost of goods sold, and in the denominator I have a certain number of dollars of revenue. So if you see over here to the side, I've written out the meaning of each ratio. When I did the initial calculation, if I kept the units, cost of goods sold and revenue, and I did this, well, of course, there's always a 1 in the denominator. But by leaving the 1 in the denominator, the units in the denominator, and the numerator, I have the meaning of the ratio. This is 46 pennies for cost of goods sold for every $1 of revenue. Now, this trick of leaving the units when you're creating a ratio like this is helpful for revealing the meaning of the ratio. And particularly in accounting and finance, those fields are just filled with ratios. You've probably heard of things like the debt to equity ratio or current assets compared to current liabilities. Those are examples of ratios, and you can use this trick. When we do division or calculate a ratio, if you keep the units in both the numerator and denominator and keep a 1 in the denominator, the meaning of the ratio is revealed. I don't know how many times when I've done complicated financial analysis and accounting analysis with ratios, this trick helped me figure out the meaning of those required ratios. All right, we have our 4 expense ratios here. Now we want to go down and look at example 6, where we're making a budget. And example 6, we'll have our first example of mixed cell references and assumption tables. Now down here we have our 4 costs, and here are those percentages we just calculated above. Here's our budgeted income statement, and this is in essence our projections for January through May. We already have our revenues, and I already have the formula for total expenses and our net income. So the only formula we're going to do here is to calculate cost of goods sold, operating, administrative, and other expenses. Now, the way that most people do this, even the textbooks that teach Excel, is they'll do something like this. I'm going to take January revenue, and since I'm copying it down and I need it locked, I'm going to hit the F4 key. And then we're going to multiply. And because we have cost of goods sold, operating, administrative, and other in the same vertical order as we do down here in our assumption table for our formula inputs, I can simply click on a relative cell reference 10 cells below. And when I Control-Enter, and I'm not going to double click, I'm just going to drag it down, go to the last cell and hit F2. That works perfect. It's locked on the January revenue, and we have each one of our percentages. Then we'd come over here, lock the revenue for February, and get our cost of goods sold relative cell reference, Control-Enter, and copy it down. Now, in this example, we would only have to create 5 different formulas. For the full year, we would have to create 12 separate formulas. We do not want to do that. If we know how to use mixed cell references, we can create one formula there, copy it down and over. Now I'm going to delete these. And I'm going to make a basic formula that looks at January revenue, and I'm going to multiply times our first expense ratio down in our assumption table. Now, I would like to copy this down one cell and to the side and just look at how these cell references will move, because I haven't put dollar signs, so right now they're relative. Control-Enter. Now I'm going to copy it down one. It looks like I got some sort of answer, but now I'm going to click in the cell and hit F2. That is not what I want. Range Finder clearly shows us that we have cost of goods sold from January, not January revenue. But look at this. The percentage is correct. So let's go back here, F2. Notice that B61, when I copied it down because it was relative, it changed to B62. The fact that we can see in this formula something changed and we didn't want it to change, we wanted that to remain a 61. That means if we're just putting the minimum number of dollar signs in, we can come up to this cell, F2, and I can stop the 61 from moving to 62 by putting a dollar sign. Now let's try that. Control-Enter, and I'm going to copy it down. Now when I come here and hit F2, oh, look at that. It looks like it's working. It is locked on B61. And really, that makes sense because, look, that dollar sign says, row 61, you're always going to remain 61. Now I'd like to take this formula and copy it to the side and see what would happen. I'm going to copy it to the side. Now I'm going to click in the cell and hit F2. Now we can see, well, oh, that B61 is allowed to move to C61 because there was no dollar sign back here for the B. But look at that, C72, we really wanted it B72. So notice the C moved, and we didn't want it to move. So now I'm going to go back to the original formula, F2. and I'm going to put a dollar sign in front of the thing I want to stop from moving. So I'm going to put a dollar sign right here. Now I'm going to try this. Control Enter. And when I copy it over, the B is now forced to remain locked. So I'm going to copy it over, put the cell in edit mode, and look at that. We prevented the B from moving to C by putting a dollar sign. Those are examples of mixed cell references. Now I'm going to delete this cell and this cell. Here is our formula. It says when I copy B61 down, it will remain on B61. But when I copy this cell reference to the side across the columns, it will move relatively. The B will become C. For this one, when I copy it down across the rows, there's no dollar sign in front of the 72. So that orange pointing to row 72 will move to 73, 74, and so on. So copying down, it moves relatively. But that B72, when I copy it across the columns, I'm locking it down so it will remain B all the way across. Now let's try it. Control Enter, and I'm going to copy it down. I didn't double click. And this is a struggle when people are learning. You cannot copy it down and over. Notice I'm trying to get it through the rectangular range in one sweeping motion. It will not work. You have to do it one direction, let go, and then re-grab the fill handle with your Angry Rabbit and drag it over. Now here's the moment of truth. To this day, I'm still amazed when I go diagonally all the way across to check the formula with F2. That is absolutely Excel magic. That prevented me from creating 5 different formulas. It allowed me to create one formula and complete the task of calculating expenses 5 times faster because I knew mixed cell references. Look at that. The row header is perfect. The proper cell reference down in our assumption table is perfect. Now I want to delete this, and I want to show you a different way, because a lot of the times the method we used by copying to the side and seeing which one moved and which one didn't, that's called the sledgehammer method. We don't want to do that. We want a way to look at our formula and figure out which cell references we're going to need. So I'm going to build my base formula. Hey, January revenue times the proper cost of goods sold expense ratio. Now I'm going to ask 2 questions of each cell reference, and I'm going to start with B61. And my first question is, what do I want that cell reference to be when I copy it down across the rows? Now, I want it to be locked up here. So I always look over to the side, and I'm saying, OK, I'm going to copy it down across the numbers. And if I want it locked, the fact that I'm copying across numbers tells me to put the dollar sign in front of the number. So I'm going to put dollar sign. Now I have a second question for B61. When I copy it across the columns, do I want it to move relatively, or do I want it locked on January? Well, I want it to move relatively. I want the blue one to move to February and then March. So that means no dollar sign in front of the B. Then I move on to the second cell reference, and I ask the same 2 questions. What do I want that cell reference to do when I copy down? Well, I want it to move relatively, so I'm not going to put any dollar signs. Second question, how about when I copy it across the columns? Well, I need it locked. I don't want the orange one to start moving over here. So I look up and I say, I'm copying it across the letters. And because I want it locked, that reminds me to put the dollar sign in front of the letter. And there you go. Control Enter. I'll copy it to the side this time. You can do it either direction, over and down. I'm going to click in the last cell, F2. That is absolutely beautiful. Now, I'm still going to show you 2 other tricks in relation to mixed cell references being copied through a rectangular range. I'm going to hit Delete key and come up to the top. Now, in the last example, I typed the dollar signs in, but that's not usually the way you do it if you want to be fast in creating your formula. I'm going to say equal sign, up arrow. And if I know that I need the dollar sign in front of the number, I want to use the F4 key. Watch what happens when I hit F4. Well, of course, we already know it gives us 2 dollar signs. But if you hit F4 a second time, Oh, it goes to row reference lock, but not column. When I hit the F4 key a third time, now the dollar sign's just in front of the column reference. And when I hit it a fourth time, it actually goes back to relative. So if I hit the F4 key, it toggles through the 4 basic types of cell references. I like to call it the merry-go-round key because it merry-go-rounds through all of the cell references. Now I'm going to stop with the dollar sign in front of 61 to lock row 61 times, and now I'm going to use my arrow key to arrow down to get that cost of goods sold expense ratio. And now I'm going to use the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times to lock the column, but not the row. Control, Enter. Copy it down. Remember, it's a two-step process when you are copying through a rectangular range. Now I'm going to click in the last cell in F2. Boom, there we go. Now, still one last trick when you're creating a mixed cell reference formula through a rectangular range. Now I'm going to hit the Delete key. Now this time, notice I've highlighted the entire range. Every cell in this highlighted range is going to get the same formula. So in the active cell, I can build my formula equals up arrow F4, F4 times, and down arrow to get my cost of goods sold, F4 3 times. And now with my formula in the active cell, to populate it through the entire highlighted range, I use the keyboard Control Enter. And now if I want to jump through the corners to get to this corner, I can use the keyboard Control Period. Now, Control Period always will go through all 4 corners. So I'm going to Control Period and hit F2 to verify that my mixed cell references are working. Now, I want you to notice something. I actually had the choice when creating my formula up here. I had the choice between this assumption table and this assumption table. Well, guess what? If I tried to use a horizontally oriented assumption table with a vertically oriented formula table, I couldn't use mixed cell references. It is 100% impossible if you have vertical and your assumption table is horizontal. The only way you can use mixed cell references is if the labels in the formula table are vertical and the labels and the numbers in the assumption table are also vertical. Now, the rule is you can do horizontal, horizontal, or vertical, vertical. Whichever way you do it, the orientation in the formula table and the assumption table has to be the same. Now, why is this so important? Well, the problem is not only in lots of textbooks will you see the labels in the formula table vertical, and then they'll set up the assumption table horizontal, but also templates out in the working world, you'll see vertical in the formula table, horizontal down here. As soon as you see that, you cannot use mixed cell references. So whenever possible, you reorientate the horizontal table so that it is vertical. All right, so mixed cell references. Notice this B61, when I copy it down, it is locked or absolute. When you copy it to the side, it moves relatively. This B72, notice when we copy it down, it moves relatively, but when we copy it across the columns, it is locked or absolute. Now, to properly finish up this budget, I'm actually going to edit the formulas all simultaneously. So I highlight in the active cell in the upper left corner, I hit F2. And I want to round this. I am multiplying decimals here, so I'm going to round the number is the formula, comma 2 for the penny, close parentheses. And to populate the formula through the highlighted range, I hold Control and Enter. I also want to make sure, since there are no decimals here, I'm going to decrease the decimals here. And there we go. All right, our next example, and this is example 7. We're going to look at relative and mixed cell references again, but we get to create a common-sized income statement. Now, a common-sized income statement simply requires that for each period, and we have October, November, December, we compare each account to revenue. Oh, wait a second. We already did this when we did our expense ratios for a budget. But here, we want to convert each one of the numbers for each one of the periods to percentages. We will then know how many pennies there are for each account as compared to $1 of revenue. But another great use for these types of ratios is that we can compare numbers, for example, net income numbers that have different magnitudes. So by converting each account to a percentage of revenue, it's easier to compare the different numbers, especially when they have a large magnitude. Now, if I think about the formula I need in this column, I need to take all of the accounts as a relative cell reference and compare it to my October revenue. When I'm over in this column, I need a relative cell reference to look at every account, and the denominator has to be locked on November. Now, if I'm thinking about this from the start, that means this whole column needs October, but when I copy the formula over, it needs to move to November. No problem. We can use mixed cell references in the denominator to accomplish this. All right, you ready? Equals relative cell reference for the numerator. As I copy the formula down and over, it's always 1, 2, 3 cells to my left. Then I divide. I need October revenue. Now, as I copy that B90 down, it needs to be locked on row 90. When I copy it to the side, it needs to go from B90, which is that, to C90. No problem. I'm going to put my cursor so it's touching that denominator B90 and hit the F4 key 1, 2 times. Notice I'm copying it down across the numbers or rows, and so there's a dollar sign in front of the number to lock it. When I copy this formula to the side, that B will move to C. So that one formula will work throughout this entire range. You ready? Control-Enter. Copy it down. It's going to wreck the borders there, so I immediately point to the Smart tag and say Fill Without Formatting. Now I re-grab my fill handle and drag it over. I go to diagonally furthest one away, click an F2, and sure enough, look at that. It got exactly the right account and the correct denominator. If I look at any intersecting cell, it did exactly what we want. 3 cells to my left, locked on November revenue. Now I want to add some number formatting, so I'm going to highlight all the cells. Control-1. On the number tab, I'm going to select percentage. 2 decimals is fine. Click OK. There, I have converted all of the numbers to common size percentages. It makes it easy, for example, to compare October net income to December. If we're comparing 15,000 to 55,000, it's hard to really compare. How much of an improvement is it? Well, when I have my percentage, which says net income for October was 15 pennies for every $1 of revenue. Over here in December, it was 23.88 pennies for every $1 of revenue. So we can see that there's about an 8-penny increase for every $1 of revenue. So sometimes it's easier to use percentages to compare than it is to compare the direct dollar amounts. All right, so that is mixed cell references to do a common-sized income statement. Now let's go look at a finance example for mixed cell references and absolute cell references. Now here's our same finance example we've used a few times so far. We are investing $3,500 every year, but we're not sure the rate that we're going to get, and we're not sure the number of years we're going to invest. So by putting years as column header variable and annual rate as the row header, we can use our future value function equals FV tab. Our rate, notice that's going to be for this row, it's going to be 2%. As we copy it down, though, it needs to move. So when I copy it down, I need it to be relative. I need it to move from 2% to 3 to 4%. When I copy to the side, I need it locked. I'm going across the column, so I hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times I'm locking column reference A, but not the number. That is our rate, comma. NPER, total number of periods. That's going to be our 10 years for this column here. Now notice, as I copy this formula down, I need it locked on the 10. So as I copy it down across the rows or numbers, I need to lock it. So I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2 times to lock the row, but not the column. Now, when we're copying the formula to the side, because we have not locked the B, that cell reference will move from B109 to C109, D109. So that works perfect, comma. PMT, that is the annual payment that we're making at the end of each year. That's this $3,500. Now our 2 questions. What do we want to do with that cell reference when we copy down? Well, we want it locked. How about when we copy to the side? We need it locked. So we need both dollar signs here. I hit the F4 key once. Present value is 0 because we don't have anything in the bank right now. The type is end of the period for the cash flow. That's the default, so I can leave it out. Close parentheses. Control Enter. I'm going to copy it to the side. Remember, it's a 2-step process. And then double click and send it down. Now notice we made an error here because we made the formula from the bank's point of view. At the end of 50 years, if we earn 10%, the bank would have to pay out minus $4 million, right? So no problem. We need to edit this formula. Now, I've already highlighted this. So watch this. This is a great trick. In the active cell, we hit the F2 key. And what did we do? For our cash flow, we didn't consider whether it's negative or positive cash flow. So this is our point of view. That's our money. But guess what? From our wallet or purse, it is going out. Negative cash flow from us to the bank. So from our point of view, this is a minus, a negative cash flow out of our wallet or purse. Now, I've edited the formula, and here's a great trick. To populate it throughout the entire range, even though there's formulas already in them, we can simply hold Control and Enter. And there we go. There is the correct sign numbers, but I still need to go to the corner. I'm going to Control period, period, F2. And look at that. Our rate is the row header, looking at the right 10%. Our NPER is looking at the correct column header, 50 years. And our PMT is looking at the correct absolute cell reference. That is pretty amazing. And realize we created one formula and copied it down and over instead of creating lots of individual formulas. Mixed cell references are awesome because they help us build formulas quickly. Now, let's go look at yet another example. All right, here's example 9. We're going to see a formula with mixed cell references and relative cell reference. Our goal is to calculate profit for each markup price schedule. So here's Mortimer's price schedule. Here are the items. Here's the cost. So the sofa costs $275, the lamp $125, and so on. And we've already calculated a set of prices. So at a markup of 50%, those are the prices we're going to charge for each one of these items. At a markup of 55, those are the prices. Markup of 60, those are the prices. And we need a dollar profit amount for each one of our prices. All right, this is going to be relatively straightforward because notice this is profit at 50%. Well, there's the sell price, so we need sell price minus cost. That formula will be there. We're going to copy the formula over. Then we're going to get 55% markup price minus the same cost, and then 60% markup price minus the cost. When we copy our formula down, then we need our whole new row of prices minus locked on our cost. All right, you ready? Equals, hey, we're going to take our price 1, 2, 3 cells to the left. And notice when I copy it down and over, every cell will always be looking at the price 3 cells to the left. And now we subtract our cost. but we need that 275 sofa cost in this entire row. But when we copy it down, we need it to move down to the lamp cost. So here we're asking the question, what do we want it to do when B26 is copied down? I need it to move relatively, so no dollar sign. But now when I copy it across the columns, I need it locked. Notice I'm in B26. If I didn't lock it, B26 would move to C26, which would be right here. That would be incorrect. So I come and I touch my cursor somewhere in the cell reference, and I hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. I've locked the column, but not the row. Now I can Control-Enter, copy it to the side, and then copy it down. Now, you know, I just copied it down, and I'm not sure if that copy action removed the border, so I'm going to click off to the side, and it didn't, so that's good. I go to the last cell, I hit F2. Can you believe it? It got exactly the right price. And notice for this entire row, it's getting the right price locked on the cost, however. So each one of the prices are correct. When I look up a row, sure enough, it moved. That is amazing. That's using relative and mixed cell reference with the column reference locked. All right, let's go look at our next example, example 10. All right, example 10, we're going to see mixed cell references and relative cell references, but they will be part of what is called an expandable range. Now, an expandable range just means as we copy the formula down, it'll have a single cell in the range. Then it will have 2 cells. Then it will have 3. The range will be expanding inside our formula as we copy the formula down. Not only that, but in this trick, we want to learn about the rows function. And it's going to be used to create sequential numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. Also, sometimes you'll hear the term, we're going to use the rows function to increment numbers, meaning we're always going to be adding 1. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, sometimes you want an actual formula. So when you copy the formula down, it'll show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not only that, but over here, we'll see inside a formula, we're going to use the large function. And the large function needs to know which number to pull out. The first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, and so on. All right, let's look at the rows function. We have never seen this one before. It's really straightforward. If I give the rows function 3 rows, in this case 150 to 152, rows will just count. 150, 151, 152, there are 3 rows here. If I were to give it that many, it would look and count 5 rows. All right, here we go. Expandable range inside the rows functions. Now watch this. We're going to do something we've never done before. I'm sitting in A150. I'm actually going to type the cell that the formula is in right into my formula. $150. Notice that 150 is locked. That's the row reference. Then I'm going to colon and A150. That is an example of an expandable range. As I copy the formula down, the first part of this range is locked on 150. But notice we left the dollar sign out on the second 150. So as I copy down, it'll go to 151, 152, 153, etc. Now, normally, if we have the actual cell reference inside the formula that is the same cell as the formula sits in, we get a circular reference, but not with rows function, because rows function is just counting rows in a range. All right, you ready? Close parentheses. And that is rows function to increment numbers or create sequential numbers. Control, Enter. And now I'm going to copy this down. And sure enough, it created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's look at how cool this expandable range is. Oh, the first row reference was locked, but not the second one. Enter, F2. Now it changes to 152, but that 150 is still locked. All the way down, you could see the blue range expanding. Now that's pretty cool. That's just a way to create automatic numbering. and we want the actual number to sit in the cell. But sometimes we want our number incrementer inside another formula. So a great example is the large function. Now we have some points over here, and oftentimes in scoring, we want the top 5, or in sales numbers, we want to see the top 5. So large function we saw 2 videos ago, we can give it a whole range of numbers, and I'm going to lock it with the F4 key. That's an absolute cell reference. And then for K, we give it 1, it'll get the max. We give that K 2, it'll give us the second biggest. 3, the third biggest. Now, if we actually had the number right here, we just click on a relative cell reference and copy the formula down. But sometimes you do not have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the cell directly to the left. So you need inside your formula that number incrementer. So I'm using rows. And now I'm sitting in B150. So I B $150 colon B150. There's our expandable range. 150 locked, 150 not locked. It will expand, and rows will count 1, 2, 3, 4 as it copies down. Now notice that rows number incrementer is sitting in K, so that K will tell large which large to get. Close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. And you can see it got the first biggest, then it got the second biggest. And look, there was a tie, so it got boop and boop. If we look at our formula, look at that orange range. It's expanding as we go down. Right here, if we were to click in the cell, click on the screen tip K and hit F9 just to evaluate and see what rows is delivering. Sure enough, it's delivering a 3. I'm going to click Escape to revert back to what was in the cell before I put it in edit mode. F2, and I'm going to do that same trick again. Click on the K, F9 to evaluate. Sure enough, rows is incrementing numbers directly inside our formula. Escape. All right, so examples 1 to 10, we're looking at the 4 basic cell references. Relative, absolute, mixed with the column lock, mixed with the row lock. Now, we will have a bunch more reference examples in this video, and we want to look at, in example 11, how to save formula inputs with the scenario feature. Now notice, here's our budget example. Here's our expenses. Here are our expense ratios. And what I want to do is I want to save this set for one of our budget assumptions, then change the numbers and save that set of assumptions. Then I want to save it so I have just a button I can click, boop, and it will instantly change all of the inputs. All right, you ready? Let's highlight the labels and the numbers in the assumption table. And we have to find Scenario Manager in the Ribbon tab. Now, it used to be in 2013 and before, Data Ribbon tab, Data Tools, but they moved it in 2016. Now it's the new Forecast group. There it is, What If Analysis. And sure enough, right at the top is Scenario Manager. Now, all it's going to do is memorize these cells and what we have in the cells. I'm going to say Add. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call this Set 1. There's the cells that it is saving. It's not only saving the cells, it's saving the actual content also. I'm going to click OK. And look at that. Now this scenario values dialog box comes up, and you can actually change them here. I actually never use this. I always use the cells. I'm going to click OK. There it is. Later, we can come back here and select from our list. I'm going to close. Now, let's change these. Under a different set of assumptions, I'm going to say this one is 30. This one is 6%. This one is 10%. This is 19.5, 3.25, enter, and 11%, enter. Now I'd like to add this second set to the Scenario Manager. Now, the keyboard in 2016 is pretty long. In older versions, all the way back to 2003, there was a much shorter keyboard. So Alt-T-E will go to Forecast Group, What If, Scenario Manager. So I'm going to do it. Highlight the range. Alt-T-E, Add. This one's going to be called Set02, Enter, Enter, and then Close. All right, now we're going to do Set 3. 29, enter, 7, enter, 11, enter, 25, enter, 4, enter, and 12, enter. Highlight the range. I'm going to use the keyboard Alt-T-E, add. And this one will be called set 3. Enter, enter. Now before I click close, that button right there, show, is how we can change our assumptions. So to show set 2, I say show. And instantly the items in our assumption table changes and the formula changes. If I select set 1 and say show, instantly everything updates. Now what I'd really like to do is close this. And I'd like to have a button that I can just click, click, and everything changes. Now, we can add that button, but we have to go up to the Quick Access Toolbar. And you can see this one is at the top in this sea of green. I want to right-click and say Show Quick Access Toolbar, or the QUAT below the ribbon. So there it is. Now, it's easier to see. I want to edit it. Right-click. Customize Quick Access Toolbar. Now, here we are, Quick Access Toolbar. Choose Commands From. I want to click the drop-down and say, give me all commands. This is like 1,300-something commands that Excel can do. I'm going to click in the list because guess what? I'm going to jump down to the bottom where there's a scenario button. Then I'm going to add it to the Quick Access Toolbar. So to jump down to the S's, I'm going to type the letter S. Now I'm going to scroll down with my wheel. And sure enough, there's Scenario Manager. That opens up that dialog box. But what I want is the drop-down for Scenario. When we click Add, it's added to our Quick Access Toolbar. I click OK. And now you're not going to believe this. There's a drop-down with my scenario. So I can simply say Set 2, Set 3. And instantly, everything in the table changes based on our assumptions. So scenarios, when you have sets of assumption, an awesome, efficient trick. Now let's go look at our next example. Example number 12. We need to talk about sheet references. Now all sheet references means is this. I can make a normal cell reference, right? Boom. That means on this sheet, please go look at D192. But if I want to point this formula to a different sheet, I actually have to have the sheet name before the cell reference. All right. Now, there's two ways to create sheet references. One is to simply click on the sheet and then hit Enter. The other way is to actually open up a second copy of this workbook and work between sheets in different windows. Now, in our first example, example 12, we're simply going to see the easiest method, which is just to click on a separate sheet. Now, our goal in this example is to check if the schedule of accounts receivable, this is a schedule of accounts receivable, we need to check if that total matches the accounts receivable controlling count over on the car sheet. That's the number that we need to bring back over to this sheet. All right, so controlling account balance. Here's how you do a sheet reference. Equal sign, you have to click on the sheet you want to get a cell reference from. So I clicked on car. And notice up in the formula bar, there's the syntax for sheet reference. You got to put the name of the sheet and then exclamation point. That exclamation point is telling the formula that that text there is not text, like in double quotes, and it's not a function name. It's a sheet reference. As soon as you see an exclamation point next to text, you know it's a sheet reference. Now, I'm not clicking up there. I'm simply going to click on A5, and there it is. That's our first sheet reference. Now, what you want to make sure not to do is do not click back on the reference sheet. As soon as you have your sheet reference and cell reference, you hit Enter. Now, I'm going to put this into edit mode with F2, and there it is. Now, notice one thing about sheet references, and this will also be true about workbook references. We don't see the rainbow color-coded rangefinder. It's always going to be a black reference. Now, we want to learn a second important feature in sheet references. Notice name Explanation point. Let's just hit enter and go see what happens if we put a space in our name. So I'm going to double click this, and right between C and AR, I'm going to type a space. Enter. Now let's go look at our sheet reference. Click in the cell F2. Oh, if you have spaces, you must have single apostrophes. Now notice two things. One is our sheet reference updated. Anytime you change the name of the sheet, your formulas that are using sheet references will automatically update. Also notice that we didn't have to type this out. We just clicked on the cell and then hit enter, and it put all of the proper syntax for a sheet reference into our formula. All right, so we have that formula there. With a formula, I want to ask the question, hey, equal sign is the controlling account balance equal to our schedule of accounts receivable. When I hit enter, of course, it says false. Now, we can see this with our eyes. We know in other situations there might be a number formatting problem, but a logical formula to tell us if two things are in balance is quite helpful. Now, that's our first example of sheet reference. Now, let's go look at another way to enter sheet references. Now, example 13, our goal here is to calculate January and February commissions. Here's our two columns of sales numbers when the commission rates are on an assumption sheet. Now, instead of an assumption table, sometimes people like to isolate their assumptions on an assumption sheet. I'm going to click on this sheet. And sure enough, we have our January commission and February commission rates on this assumption sheet. Now, I want to go back over to our reference. And here's the deal. Instead of clicking back and forth between two sheets, I actually want to open up a second view of this workbook. And it's not a duplicate. It's just seeing the same workbook in two windows. That way we can adjust the sheets on the two windows and click back and forth with ease. To open up a second view of this workbook, I go to View, and in the Window group, I say New Window. Now, wait a second. Watch the title bar up here. I'm going to click New Window. And just like that, the title bar says :2. That means this is a second view of that workbook. I'm going to use Control-Tab to jump back to the other workbook. Now, this one says :1. Of course, down here in the taskbar, we can see there are two windows open. All right, so let's go back up to View and Arrange All to arrange our two workbooks. I click. Tiled is fine. When I click OK, look at that. We have two views of the same workbook. Now, in the second workbook, I'm going to click on the Assumption Sheet. Now, notice here it says 2, and I have Assumption Sheet in View. Over here, here's View 1, and there's the reference sheet. Now, let's build our formula. Equal sign, relative cell reference, 1, 2 to my left. As I copy it down and over, it will work fine. Times, and now I can click over once to activate the sheet, second to get the sheet reference. Notice I can see it up in this formula bar, up in this formula bar, and I can see it right here. When I click once to activate this workbook, oh, check that out. That is so cool. I have the ability to click back over here, and that sheet name did not change. Now, notice something about A2. When I copy January commission rate from A2 over here, when I copy it over a column, I want that A2 to move to B2. But when I copy it down, I need that A2 lock. So another important feature for sheet references is they can be any one of the 4 basic cell references. In this case, I'm going to hit F4 once and twice. I'm going to lock the row reference, but not the column reference. Remember, A2, when I copy over, needs to move to B2. So there you go. Control-Enter. Copy it over. Copy it down. Go to the last cell, F2, and sure enough, it got B2 correct from the assumption sheet, and it has the correct February sales number. So by opening up two views of the same workbook, it's much easier to work back and forth when you're doing sheet references. Now I'm going to come over to the second view, and in the title bar, I'm going to close. Now to activate this window, I'm going to click, and to maximize it, I'm going to use Window Up Arrow. That's the same as the Maximize button. All right, I'm clicking in the top cell, and here too, since we're multiplying decimals, F2, and I need to round to the penny, comma 2, close parentheses, and watch what happens. Right now, we have this total here, Control-Enter. I'm going to copy it down. We can already see the total has changed. So remember, anytime you're multiplying or dividing decimals with extraneous pennies in this case, and you have some subsequent calculation that relies on the accuracy and rounding of these calculations, you got to use the round function. All right, sheet references, quite useful. All right, let's go to our next example. Now, example 14, we have to talk about workbook references. Yes, that means we can actually have a formula that points to a cell reference in a different workbook. Now, when you download the files, one of the files you can download is May Net Income. And I need to get May Net Income from MayNetIncome.xlsx workbook over into cell B229 in the Business 218 Video for Start.xlsm workbook. Now, it's as simple as this. If I type an equal sign, now I need to jump over to the other workbook. So I can either click down on the taskbar and then click on the workbook, or I can use the keyboard Control-Tab. That jumps over to the other Excel workbook file. Control-Tab is different than Alt-Tab. Alt-Tab jumps between windows. Control-Tab jumps between Excel workbooks. Now you can see the formula doesn't have anything yet, but when I click on cell B10, there is our first workbook reference. I'm going to hit Enter, and we'll talk about the syntax for it over here. We're back in our Business 218 Video for Start file. So I click in this cell and F2. Now, the first thing you notice is, by default, the cell reference is locked. You can absolutely change that. The 4 basic cell references are still available. If I hit the F4, 1, 2, 3, it is still our merry-go-round key that toggles between the different cell references. I'm never going to copy this anywhere, so it doesn't matter. Now, the rest of the syntax, square brackets contain the full Excel workbook file name. And then there's our single apostrophes wrapped around the workbook file name and the sheet name. Then there's our explanation point. That means May Net Income is the name of the sheet and B10. So this formula is read B10 on the sheet May Net Income in the Excel workbook file, MayNetIncome.xlsx. Now I'm going to hit Enter. I'm going to get my equals. And I need to make a formula here to calculate net income for June. So I click on that cell reference, minus SUM, tab, up arrow, hold Shift and up, 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 up. Then I can close parentheses, and I've calculated in this cell net income for June. Now I can calculate the difference equals the latest net income minus past month net income. That will give me the change. Now I want to look at this, F2. That is how the workbook reference looks when you create it. But now I want to go close that file. And guess what? The two files are communicating with each other through this workbook reference. All right, notice, Enter. Let's go over to the other file, Control-Tab. I'm going to close it, either the X in the upper corner or Alt F4. Now, can you guess what's going to be in our formula? If these two files are communicating, it better be the full file path name. So when I click in the cell in F2, there it is, the full file path. That is the only way that they can communicate. Now I'm going to Control S, and I'm going to close this workbook either with the X or Alt F4. I've opened up May Net Income, and now I'm going to change one of the numbers and Enter. So really, the main net income should be $657. Now we're going to close this and save it. Now notice I'm in Windows Explorer. These two files are communicating with each other. If you ever like cut and paste this somewhere else, it may not be able to communicate anymore. So in general, I like to keep the workbooks together if I'm using workbook references. Many times that's not possible, but just be aware that they are communicating. Now, when we open up this file and there's a workbook reference, if our settings are in such a way to give us a warning, we'll see a warning. So I'm going to open this file, and there is our polite warning. It's asking us, do you want to update or not update? Now, I'm going to say not update. Most of the time I say update because they're communicating with each other. I want them to update. But if you say don't update, well, there it is, 557. We know in that other workbook it's 657. Now, we need to see where we can work with workbook references, data, connections, and there it is, edit links. Now, edit links allows us to do a few different things. There is our workbook. I could say update values. I could say change source. And let's look at this, change source. This allows you, if the file has moved, to navigate and redirect it. Now I'm going to click Escape. Open source, that will open the source file. Break links, that's when you no longer want a link. And down here, startup prompt. I'm going to click on this. This is how you decide what message to get. I'm going to say let users choose to display the alert or not. That's the message you get when you open it up. Now let's go ahead and update it. So update values. And sure enough, you can see down here, it has updated. OK, so workbook references, sometimes they are helpful. Now let's go look at our next example. You're not going to believe this. We have to get our 3D glasses out for this one. No, not really. We're going to do 3D references without 3D glasses. Now, I already have the answer here, so I'm going to delete this. Now, here's our setup for this one. We need to add for our corporate totals all of the products for all of the months. There's a bunch of numbers. And if you look over here, there's an Oakland sheet. And notice something about the Oakland sheet. The template is exactly the same setup. If I go over to the CTAC sheet, exactly the same setup. Tacoma sheet, exactly the same setup. If that's the case, you can use 3D references. Now let's go back to references. And there it is. I'm in cell B238. Now it doesn't matter that there's a B238 and the January quad on these other sheets actually sits in a different cell. What matters is that the actual shape and structure of those templates on the other sheet are exactly the same. If that's true, you can use 3D cell references. Now here's our goal. For January quad, I need to get from the Oakland sheet, January quad. Then from the CTAC sheet, January quad. Tacoma, January quad. And then on the corporate sheet, I need all of the proper cells from each one of the templates. For example, here I need to add April tri-fly. Now, what it means by 3D, and I'm going to go back to the Oakland sheet. Notice there's a B3. Notice on CTAC, it does matter that this template is in the same cell, B3. And over on Tacoma, B3. What I want to do is add up all the B3s from sheet Oakland all the way to Tacoma. Let's go back to references and see how to do this. Now, before we do it, I need to remind you, and you should all know this from our prerequisite class. If I come over to the side, I've just selected H243. Before I click on H245, if I hold the Shift key and then click, that's the method to highlight everything from one bookend to the other and everything in between. That's going to be necessary as a keyboard mouse trick when we highlight the sheets from Oakland all the way to Tacoma. All right, here we are. Notice I'm on the reference sheet. I'm in the cell for January. I'm going to use the keyboard for the auto sum, Alt equals. It doesn't know where to go because there's no numbers anywhere. But let's start our 3D reference. I'm going to click on the Oakland sheet. You can see up in the formula bar it says Oakland exclamation point. Now I'm going to click on B3. So far, it's just Oakland exclamation point B3. But now, watch this. Before I click on Tacoma, what am I going to hold? The Shift key. Then when I click on Tacoma, it's highlighted everything from Oakland all the way to Tacoma. And if you look up in the formula bar, there is our 3D reference. Sheet Oakland all the way to Tacoma. Please add up all of the B3s. When I hit Enter, that is amazing. F2. And what's so amazing about 3D references, when it says Oakland colon Tacoma, and I'm going to click Escape. If I were to ever insert any sheets between Oakland and Tacoma, this F2, this formula would totally update. Just like regular cell references like A1 colon A5, if you insert a row for those normal references, everything updates. Same with 3D references. Insert a sheet, and it totally updates. All right, ready? Control Enter. Copy it down. Copy it over. Go to the last cell, hit F2. That is amazing. 3D cell references. All right, hit Enter. We want to look at our next example, and we're going to talk about example 16. We got to talk about the amazing defined names feature. Now, we talked about defined names in the prerequisite class Business 216, but we want to remind ourselves here. Now, all it means is if I'm going to use that cell in a formula, or I'm going to use this whole column over in a formula over here, I can name that cell. So instead of B252 or this entire range, B263 all the way to 271, we can give it a name. And then we can use those names in the formula. Now, the basics of creating a name, if I want to name this cell amount, I click in the cell, and look, here's the formula bar, and all the way to the left, if you hover your cursor, that's the name box. I can click in it and notice that B252 is highlighted, and I'm going to call this amount and Enter. Now that cell is named amount. If I click over here and then back, notice it no longer shows B252. It's amount. Now we do want to talk about the naming conventions. The first character of a name must be either a letter, underscore, or backslash. Characters allowed, letters, numbers, periods, underscores. Maximum of 255 characters, no spaces. And guess what? If I come up here and try to name that cell right there, Return on Equity 2016. So I'm going to try it. Return on Equity. That's a common ratio used in accounting and financial analysis. And we wanted to name that cell 2016 because that's the cell that maybe had return on equity in 2016. Watch what happens. And actually, this will reveal an awesome trick for the name box. It'll actually jump to cell ROE 2016. So when I hit Enter, you got to be kidding me. There's a column called ROE. And of course, there's a row called 2016. So you actually can never use cell names. Now, I actually want to use that same trick. I'm going to click back in the name box, and there's a drop-down arrow. I can select amount, and now I'm using the name box and define names to jump to a different part of the workbook. Look at that. Instantly, I jump back to references. Now, actually, example 18 is use defined names to jump to other places. I want to show you something here. Sometimes people have on the cash sheet and the AR sheet, they have accounts like this. So watch this. In cell where the account number is, I'm going to come up to the name box and type AR and Enter. Now I'm going to come over to cash. And in the account number cell, I'm going to type cash. And now, if you had all sorts of sheets with accounts, you can simply use it as a go-to mechanism. So I'm going to say AR, and instantly I jump to AR. Cash, I instantly jump to cash. Amount, and I jump back to the example we were just working on. Now, I actually want to delete that name. And not only that, I want to see where I can go to edit names. Because sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes you don't need your names anymore. Hey, up on the Formula Ribbon tab, there's a whole group called nothing but Define Names. Here's the Name Manager. I'm going to click Name Manager. And there are our names. Dog tags are the icons to indicate defined names. That little table icon means these are named tables in our Excel workbook file. I can expand the values. Refers to. There's also a scope column, which we don't see here. Scope is when you have the same name on multiple sheets. Now I want to click on Amount, and if I wanted to edit, I could click Edit. That's how, if you make a mistake, you could change it. I'm going to click Escape. I want to click on Amount and delete it. Click OK. Click Close. The reason I want to delete it is because in this case, I want to name this cell Amount, this cell Years, and this cell Annual Rate. I don't want to name these manually. I want to highlight the names, which are sitting to the left, and the three cells. Because I've highlighted the cells and there's a name to the left for each one of them, I can simply come up to Define Names and Create from Selection. Boop. Now, be sure to read this, because sometimes it'll come checked with multiple checks, and you have to say where the names are coming from. Top row, left column, bottom row, right column. It's definitely the left column. And this is pretty good at guessing, because these are numbers and these are text, right? When I click OK, instantly in my dropdown I have Amount. And notice what it did to Annual Rate. We are not allowed to have spaces, so it was polite. It put an underscore. And if I go to Years, there it is, Years. Now I want to build a formula. And this example is exactly why people like names, because in their formula, it will be explicit. We will be able to, in essence, read the formula inputs in natural language. Equals, and this is our future value calculation. Now I'm going to get the rate, and notice I click on it, and it puts the defined name in, comma. NPER, total number of periods, that's 15. I mean years, comma, and the PMT, that is called amount. That is a natural language formula. If you come and look at this, you can read it from left to right. Now, we've seen this. This is the third or fourth time we've seen this already in this video. Present value, that means the amount in the bank. We don't have any right now. And type, this is end payment. So that default will work. Close parentheses. Now, before we hit Enter, we want to make sure this amount is a cash flow. This is from our point of view. It's coming out of our wallet each period and into the bank. So it's a negative from our point of view. So I'm going to put minus. And then Enter. Now, I want you to notice something. If I hit F2, I've already built formulas pointing to these recently named cells. So watch this. This is an awesome feature. I can highlight these, go up to Define Names, and there it is, Apply Names. And it's pretty smart. It knows that the cell references in those formulas recently had names added. So when I click OK, it just applied those names. Years times amount. I just love it. That is an easy-to-read formula. And down here, well, of course, that one didn't have names. Now, let's see how to name a column. Now, in this case, I'm going to use that same feature. Create names from selection, because I want this column to be called Sales and this column to be called Product. I'm going to use the keyboard, Control-Shift-F3. Now, be careful here. It's trying to name all of these number cells to the right. That would be terrible. I want to uncheck that. I only want the names to come from the top row. Now, when I click OK, from my drop down up here, I have Sales and I have product. Now I can come over and use this in my formula. Alt equals, and I could come over and highlight. And as we saw before, it puts it in. But I want to show you another trick. Sometimes you're not near the cells, and you're like, man, I forgot what the name is. Well, the keyboard F3 is paste name. And I can look through, and if it prompts my memory, I can then select sales, click OK, and that is applied. Now, I'm going to go equals max tab and then S. And notice, from our drop-down, we've only seen function names so far, but define names and also table names will show up in this drop-down. I'm going to hit Tab and Enter. Equals MIN tab, S tab, Enter. So I've calculated total, max, and min using the sales column. Now, another really awesome use for define names is the fact that by default, they're absolute cell references. Now, my goal here is to add all the sales for each one of these products. So I'm using the SUMIFS function. Sum range, S tab, comma. Criteria range, I'm going to try a P, R, O, D. And notice, there is a function called product which multiplies everything in a range. So you got to be careful. Sometimes if you have the same name, I'm going to down arrow and accept the gold dog tag and tab. Comma, left arrow, and there we go. The beauty of defined names for this example is that they are absolute by default. So when I Control Enter and double click and send it down, go to the last cell, F2, sure enough, they are locked. If you ever wanted to change that, which is a rare occurrence, you could come up to Name Manager. And of course, click and then edit your cell references here. All right, define names, quite helpful. Don't forget there's notes here, and those PDF notes have a bunch of notes on define names also. Now let's scroll down and talk about our next topic. And now examples 19 all the way to 24 are going to involve table formula nomenclatures and the Excel table feature. Now, we've already talked about this Excel table feature and table formula nomenclature before, but here we're going to see a number of examples, including how to do relative mixed and absolute cell references when you're using table formula nomenclature. Now, we need to convert this to a table. We either go up to Insert, Table, Group, Table, or we click in a single cell and use Control-T. When I hit Enter, that is an Excel table. It has drop-downs with sort and filter, formatting, and most importantly is if we add records below or new columns, all the ranges are dynamic. So anything pointing to the Excel table like formulas or pivot tables will update. Now we have to name this table. Table Tools, Design, Properties, Table Name, or we can use the keyboard Alt-JTA. And I'm going to name this Sales, and we're going to have a problem. When I hit Enter, it's polite. It reminds me I already have a defined name called Sales. So I'm going to click Escape, and now I'm going to call it Sales Table and Enter. Now notice that we just created our table name. Hey, there's the drop-down for defined name we were using just a few minutes ago. But there's our table name. Now I can create a formula that points to the sales field. Alt equals, and when I highlight, we can clearly see we get table name and field name in square brackets. Enter. We can also point to multiple columns, and when we copy table formula nomenclature down, the ranges will be locked. Now, later we'll see an important difference between defined names and table formula nomenclature when you're copying a locked range. But right now we're just going to put SUMIFS. Sum range. There it is. Table name and field name in square bracket, comma. Criteria range. I highlight table name, field name in square brackets, comma, and I have relative cell reference. Now I can close parentheses, Control Enter. Double click and I copied that formula down. When I go to the last cell and hit F2, sure enough, the ranges are locked. That cell reference moved relatively. So when you copy table formula nomenclature with fields down a column, they are locked. Now we want to see a great example we did not see earlier in the class. Earlier in the class, we saw how to add records to an Excel table, and then everything updates. But let's add a new column. I need to calculate based on this commission rate the commissions for each one of our sales. So right next to the Excel table, I'm going to type commission dollars. And when I hit Enter, a new column is added to our table. Now, we want to actually create a formula that looks at the sales in this row times locked on the commission rate. So you ready? Equals, and this is going to be the first time we've seen a relative cell reference in table formula nomenclature. You see, I'm clicking in this row, and there it is, the syntax for relative cell reference in a table. You got to have the square brackets, the @ symbol, and the name of the field. Because it has an @ symbol, it will not get the whole sales column like it did over here. It'll always go and get the sales number for this row. Times, and now I'm going to click on this cell. This is, of course, outside the table, so I hit F4 to lock it. Now I can Enter. And many times we will automatically populate the column. This didn't do it, so I'm going to point to the drop-down and say overwrite all cells in this column with the formula. And just like that, it is copied down. I'm going to go down to the last cell and hit F2. And you see, sure enough, relative cell reference, when you're inside the table and you're referring on the same row to that sales column, that's the syntax for relative cell reference. Enter. Now we're going to have to do the same thing. We're multiplying with the chance of having extraneous decimals. In fact, we can see the extraneous decimals. And these formula results are being used by other formulas, so we have to round. R-O-U-N-D, round. The number, that little formula bit right there, comma, number of digits 2, close parentheses, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Come to the last cell, F2, looking good. All right, now let's go to our next example. We want to learn about mixed references in table formula nomenclature. Now here, I need to add from this table, which is a defects table, January, February, March. I just need to add January, February, and March. Now, there is no April. The reason that I put April here is I want to show you a very strange characteristic for column reference from a table. If I have a formula that is pointing to the whole column, that means table name and field name, when you copy to the side, it actually moves like a relative cell reference. Up here, we saw when you copy it down, it's locked. So every one of these are locked on sales. Locked on sales. But if you, in this case, point to a column and copy it to the side, it assumes that you want the column reference to move. And I put April here because something strange will happen. When I copy the formula over to the end of the table to March, when I copy it one cell further, it jumps back to the first column. So let's do this. Alt equals, and I'm going to highlight. So far, it's looking fine. The name of the table, field name in square brackets. Control Enter, copy it to the side. And now I'm going to click in February, F2. Whoa, the field changed to February. You can see it right there. When I go to March, table name locked. But when I copy the column field reference to the side, it moved to March. And finally, since March is the last column, when I keep copying it, it's programmed to jump back to the first column, which, of course, doesn't make any sense here. Now, in our 24th example, which I'm going to jump to right now, we're going to see if you didn't want it to move relatively, how to lock. So example number 24 here. Now, it's kind of a strange syntax, and there is no F4 key to lock it. So we're actually going to have to manually type this out. It's very clunky. But if you want to use the Excel table feature because you have expanding records or you might add columns or something like that, then we do need to learn how to lock a reference in an Excel table. All right, ready? Our goal here is we're running a dog kennel where we take care of dogs, and sometimes we buy them food, accessories, boarding. Here's all the transactions. So for the dog we're taking care of, Mandy, we had various transactions, one for food, one for accessories, one for boarding. So we need a summarization table where we have the dog names down the side, and then we have the categories for expenses along the column headers. And we need a formula that we can copy down and over that will always add from the amounts column based on whichever dog from the dog column and whichever category for expense from the category column. So you ready? Equals sum ifs, sum range, and I'm going to highlight amount. Now when I highlight it, that is not an absolute cell reference. We already saw if we copy it to the side right now, it would jump to the front. But if I copy down, it's locked. But I need it locked everywhere. So I'm actually going to highlight this. And I have to do this. I don't know how to do this any other way but manually. Square bracket. Come to the end, colon, Control V, close square bracket. Oh, that is just crazy. How cumbersome is that? But that's how you lock. That means no matter if we copy down and over, it's always locked on amount. That's the sum range, comma, criteria range. Well, I'm going to need to pull something from dog and then from category. So I'm going to start with dog. All right, now I'm going to come to the end, add a second square bracket, and now I'll do it manually. Colon, and watch what happens when I type a square bracket. Oh, all of the elements from a table pop up. Dog is there, so I hit Tab. Then I have to close square bracket, close square bracket. Wow, so that one's locked. Comma, and now I need the criteria. There's our dog for this row. Now I need that locked when I copy it across the columns, but I need it to move relatively when I copy down. So I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2, 3 times. I'm locking column reference G, but not 329. Comma. Criteria range 2, I need to go from the categories column. So I highlight, second start square bracket, colon, open square bracket, C, tab, close square bracket, 2 of them. So now criteria range 2 is locked, comma. And now I need column header. And for this, I need it locked when I copy down, but it needs to move relatively side to side. So I'm going to hit the F4 key 1, 2 times, lock the row, but not the column. Oh, my heavens. Close parentheses. Control Enter. Double click and send it down. Copy it to the side. Go to the last cell, F2. And sure enough, that is the most complicated reference formula that we've done in this class. Everything is locked down for columns. And our row header and column header criteria for this adding works perfectly. Enter. All right, now we want to actually see 2 more examples. And I'll save the best one for last, which is example 23. And you can see up here I left 20 out. So I actually want to go over to TFN on a different sheet. Remember, this table is called Sales Table. So I'm going to click on TFN on a different sheet. And now for example 20, I want to do table formula nomenclature from a different sheet. And this is one great benefit of using table formula nomenclature. I want to do that same calculation over here. So I'm going to type sum ifs. For the sum range, I need sales table. So I'm going to type in S. And notice, there's our 3 icons. Gold dog tag means define name. Table icon means Excel table. And F of X icon means function. So I'm going to down arrow and tab. Now, anytime I type an open square bracket, the drop-down is polite. It gives me all the elements from the table, field names, and then elements like everything, field names, and all the records. just the data, that's the inside part, just the headers, that would be just the headers, total rows, which we haven't used yet in this class. Now, I want sales, so I'm going to hit Tab, close square bracket, comma, criteria range, it's the same, S, down arrow, Tab, open square bracket. So one of the advantages of table formula nomenclature is if you're on some other, you can select whatever you want as soon as you type an open square bracket. I need product, so down arrow, Tab, close square bracket, comma, and then for criteria, I hit left arrow, and there it is, relative cell reference. Now I can Control Enter, double click, and send it down. Now, a strange use, which sometimes has benefit, is if we want to count fields. That means we need a formula that will always look at that table. And if we add or subtract columns, it will always tell us on this sheet how many fields are in the table. So equals, and I'm going to count because fields are text. And I'm going to type S down arrow to get my sales table, open square bracket. And watch this. I'm going to use headers. Those are the field names. Close square bracket. Now remember, we added a third column, so this should tell us 3 when I hit Enter. If I were to go back over to the reference sheet and just for a moment point to this corner, and I'm going to click and drag, knowing that I can come back and undo that later. When I come back over here, oh, look at that. It totally is counting fields. Go back over here. I'm going to Control Z. Now it's back part of the table. And there it is. It totally updates counting headers. All right, we have one last example, and I saved the best for last for table formula nomenclature. Now, here we have an invoice. And what I'd like is I would like automatically to have a drop-down arrow that points over to our lookup table. I want to be able to select from a drop-down any product I have in this table. Then I want the VLOOKUP function to look up the price. But if I add new records, I want everything in the invoice to update. I'm going to come over to the lookup table, Control-T, Enter, Alt-J-T-A to name it. Up in the properties table name, I named it Product Lookup Table and Enter. Now I want to highlight all these cells. And I would like to use Data Validation List to always look in the first column and then give me a drop-down so I can select from my list of products. I go up to Data, Data Tools, and there's Data Validation. I can click the button. And the default for data validation, of course, is any value. But I want to validate what data goes into these cells. And I want a drop-down so I allow only items from a list. And now in the source, I'm going to highlight the first column. Now notice it doesn't put table formula nomenclature in, but that range will work inside of data validation source. It will totally expand when the table expands. When I click OK, there is my dropdown. That's pretty sweet. Now just for our example here, I'm going to type 5 because the person's buying 5 quads. And now I want VLOOKUP to look up the price based on the quad. Equals VL tab, lookup value, relative cell reference, comma, and the table array. Watch what happens when I highlight the inside of the table. Oh, look at that. Product lookup table. And that part of table formula nomenclature is locked in all directions. And if we added any extra columns, it would totally expand. Comma, what am I looking up? Well, I'm looking up the quad, finding a match in the first column, and then I need to tell the VLOOKUP function which column, 1 or 2, has the thing I want to go and get and bring back to the cell. Well, 1, 2, the second column has the price I want to go and get and bring back, so I put in column index number, I just type a 2. Comma. The lookup range, this is exact match because I want to find an exact match. QUAD, QUAD in the first column. Now, I can put false or 0. That tells VLOOKUP we're doing an exact match. Close parentheses. Control Enter and copy it down. Now, I do not want NAs to show up. And the reason why, of course, is it's trying to find nothing, and it can't find nothing over here. So since 2013, there's a great function built exactly for this reason. If, not if function, because then we'd have to put in a logical test and give it two options. It's if NA. So I enter that, and the value is, in our case, VLOOKUP. When VLOOKUP does not come to an NA, it'll just put the result of VLOOKUP. But when VLOOKUP delivers an NA, I come to the end, comma. And right there, it says value if NA. I'm putting the syntax for show nothing, double quote, double quote. Now, technically, that is a zero-length text string, but it is also the syntax for our formula to show nothing, close parentheses. Control-Enter, and notice I actually have to copy this down and then remember to copy it up. Now, the total for this row equals, and I'm going to use round because I'm not quite sure if there's ever going to be extraneous pennies. I'm going to say, hey, units times price and comma 2 because I'm rounding to the penny. This is an invoice that has to do with money, and we don't have partial pennies, so I'm rounding to the penny. Close parentheses, Control-Enter, and I can copy this one down. Oh, look at that, same thing. If I look here, it's trying to multiply. Well, it looks like 0 times 0, but remember, right here, if NA is dumping a zero-length text string into the cell. I'm not allowed to multiply something that's text times this cell actually does have nothing, which Excel thinks is 0. So I have to change this formula. I come to the top, F2, and instead of if NA, ever since Excel 2007, we have if error. And if error is similar to if NA, whatever's in the value. If it doesn't evaluate to an error, it just puts whatever this evaluates to in the cell. But I come to the end, comma, and now it's saying, what do you want me to put in the cell if it's an error? Same thing, double quote, double quote. That's the way we can show nothing. Close parentheses, Control-Enter, and copy it down. Now we have an invoice. If I come over here and select Carlota and type 10, that is amazing. Now, here's what's really amazing. If I come down here and I type Aspen, as soon as I hit Tab and then enter a price, 25, watch what happens. I come over here. That is a dynamic dropdown that totally acknowledges that the table has expanded. When I select Aspen, look at that. VLOOKUP totally had an expandable table also. I can say 25, Control-Enter, and boom, there we are. Everything from our data validation dropdown to our VLOOKUP is dynamically working. Wow, that was an epic video all about references. We learned in examples 24 to 19 about table formula nomenclature, including how to do relative, mixed, and absolute references. Example 16 to 18, we talked about define names. Example 15, we talked about 3D references. We talked in example 14 about workbook references. Examples 13 and 12, we did sheet references. Example 11, we talked about the scenario feature for saving formula inputs. And then examples 10, Control Home, all the way to 1, we talked about the 4 basic cell references, relative, absolute, mixed with the column lock, and mixed with the row locked. Now you can go ahead to the end of this workbook, and there are homework problems for you to practice. All right, next video we'll get to talk about making calculations with formula with multiple conditions or criteria. All right, we'll see you next video.